Hi, my name is Sarah and welcome back to Freshly Read Books. So today we're going to be talking about Love and Other Thought Experiments, which is one of the books on the 2020 Booker Longlist. At this point, we do already know that this book did not make it onto the shortlist, but still being on the long list is a huge accomplishment, especially to be made by somebody who is not really known for being an author, but is instead known for acting. And in the little bit of research and reading around I've done, it sounds like Sophie actually had a really hard time getting this book published because of how unique it was. And I have to say, I agree, this book is very unique. So the premise of this book, which is tough to explain because I did read, of course, the synopsis of this book back when it was announced to be on the long list. And even then I remember thinking, what a weird way to write a synopsis. And then I understood later why it was written that way. But I'll start with kind of what they tell you from the back, which is we have couple Rachel and Eliza, who's a story, and one night in the middle of the night, Rachel wakes up and is convinced that an ant has crawled into her eye and gotten up into her brain. And she tells Eliza this, and then that kind of starts calling into question their entire relationship. That's basically what the back says. It does talk about there being interlinked stories across time, place, and perspective. And I guess I just brushed over that part when I was reading the synopsis originally because I did not even remember that. I went into this thinking that it was going to be entirely about Rachel and Eliza, and I thought that maybe it would even be largely based in that one night, and that it would just evolve into this long conversation, and we'd learn more about both Rachel and Eliza and maybe their past lives, how they got together, all that. And while you do get that through the story, it definitely went about it in a way that I didn't expect and didn't realize. So I'd like to add, in addition to what is written on the back, when they say interlinked stories, it is very segmented out, especially in the beginning. It starts to become more clear as you go on. And they do really follow thought experiments. So that's, of course, where it comes from in the title, but every chapter or story or whatever you want to call it starts off with a thought experiment, and then it gets into the story. And it seems like most of them are pretty related to each other. Sometimes it's harder to find than others, or sometimes you can't really find it when you read that story or that chapter, and then later on you'll read more and it'll have applied to that one, and then maybe it makes a little bit more sense than it did previously. But I wouldn't look for the exact premises of the thought experiments to show up in the story, because I think sometimes it was very clear, while other times it was just inspiration was taken from the thought experiment. So typically, if you've watched other videos that I've made about the Booker 2020 long list books, you'll know that I like to segment out my reviews with different themes and just talk about the themes that either had the biggest impact to me, if they were a bit of a letdown, but you could definitely tell that it was still in there, or that I just found and really loved and wanted to talk about. This book makes that a little bit more challenging because I think theme-wise it's pretty obvious, and I know that in the past I've said that I don't like an obvious theme, but in this case I think that it takes that obvious theme and makes it diverse enough. Ooh, okay, long sleeve seemed like a good idea before I started this. But themes in this book is going to be a challenge. So I don't even know if I want to call it themes. I'm still going to segment out this video, but it'll just be different sections. It's not necessarily themes. Some maybe could be considered that, and then others are just stuff I want to talk about. Okay. So I think since the story itself starts with the ant, I would also like to start with the ant. And I think that largely the ant could represent a ton of different things, which I think is why it was chosen as being a part of this story. But I think the main thing that the ant represents is really the idea of belief in general, especially as it pertains to relationships. Rachel truly believes that there is an ant inside of her head, and Eliza can choose to believe this in order to remain in agreement with her significant other, or Eliza can not believe her and kind of go with more of the logical side. This is an unbelievable thing, and now she's doubting her significant other, even though it's about something that seems inconsequential. Certainly they have other aspects of their relationship that they agree on, and that it's built on something, of course, but because Eliza can't believe this, she is not believing in her significant other, she's not trusting her, and that does kind of whittle away at their relationship. And it's a fascinating thing because it's really not about the aunt at all, and I think that the story is trying to say that in any relationship there is like an aunt, or maybe not even just one thing, but maybe a couple of things where two partners differ, and the ability to be able to believe in your partner despite the fact that something might seem unbelievable or it strikes you as something that doesn't really fit your perception of the world, that can do a lot of harm to a relationship. And the more important that thing is to somebody, the more harm it can do. If for both parties it's not a huge deal, then that's fine. You can move past it, you can maybe talk about it, without it turning into an argument. But when it's something that's even larger, then that's a harder thing to overcome. Rachel believes there is something inside of her, so that's a huge deal to her. It's her whole being, it's always there. And if Eliza can't believe this about Rachel, then it's essentially her not believing something that's inside of Rachel. So in general, it's a really neat metaphor. Like I said, the aunt can represent a lot of different things at different points in the book, so it's definitely not just that, but I do think that that's the biggest one. So next I'd like to talk about these like little bits of code. Don't worry, this is super early into the book, no spoilers, but there's in certain stories little like bits of code throughout the story, and I think that this draws from a larger theme of like, do we really exist, or do we exist how we think we exist? So one thing I think that's come up quite a bit in like the mainstream recently-ish is like, are we living in a simulation? Like, is this really real, or has this been manufactured and we just believe it's real because it's all we know, we can't see outside of it? But then that kind of spirals into, well, does it matter if it's not real? Because we believe it to be real, and our feelings are still real. So our feelings about the world around us, about our understanding of the world around us, that's still real, and really that's all that matters to us if that's all we can see. This book definitely dives into that kind of mindset, but it's more about the people themselves instead of it being about the entire world. Like, a person could be just a very smart computer. If you could program completely a person to be programmed to not really think of themselves as a computer, but instead to think of themselves as a human being, and maybe none of your thoughts or actions or choices at all, but you've just been completely programmed to do the things that you do, and also to feel like you have control over that, to feel as if you are moving through the world as your own human being, your own very unique human being. And then of course that goes back to the, well, if you feel that way, then what else matters? Does it really matter if every human in the world has been manufactured to work exactly the way that they work, if every human in the world also feels like they are a unique human being? So those are really the two, like this ant and the manufactured human being, or the manufactured, I don't even know what I'm going to call that. I don't think I even introduced that as a topic when I just started talking about it. But those were the most like theme-like topics that I have. But I did want to talk about the idea of having these thought experiments in the book as a whole. And I guess really this is a good point to talk about my thoughts on it, how I felt about the book personally. So for Love and Other Thought Experiments, this was on my list of predicted favorite 5 out of the entire long list. So I kind of picked 5 books out of the long list that I thought I would end up liking the most. This was on that list. It seemed really up my alley, and unfortunately, I didn't really like it as much as I thought I was going to. Going into this book, it seemed like everybody really loved or hated this, and so I expected to be on the side that loved it, just based on what I'd read about it, based on what I'd heard about it. And I'm definitely not on that side, but I'm also not on the side that hated it. I found myself very middle of the road for this book, and I went on quite a roller coaster of emotions while reading it. I buddy read it with Kieran from Katie Books, and if you could hear my voice memos to him, like sometimes I'd be like, oh, I think I'm starting to like where this is going. This is very interesting, and I can't wait to see what happens next. And then other times I'm like, I don't know why, and I don't care why, and I'm bored. And for it being a book that's as short as it is, it's kind of crazy how many times I felt that. I think for me, maybe the characters just needed to be a bit stronger, because the plot in general, I really like the idea of, but I think that books like this that try to really pull in these big ideas, and it seems like the story gets more and more larger than life. Like, it's crazy where this story goes and you wouldn't expect it at all. And I don't want to give any spoilers, because if you are going to read this book, I want you to experience that the way that I experienced it, because I was really surprised by the way that it went. Based on the place that it started in. And while I do like that in stories, and it's part of the reason why I like sci-fi that's not super heavy sci-fi, but instead starts in a very like normal place and then just like gets more and more like that, I think that that creates a struggle to write really captivating main characters that you really care about. Also, when you break the rules that we are used to so much, then it starts to feel like there's not really a consequence to anything, and like nothing really matters. And so caring about the characters becomes increasingly difficult. And I think that that was where it kind of got me. Like, at the end of the book, there was still a lot of like big things happening, but at that point I just didn't really care anymore, because it seemed like nothing really mattered. And maybe that's the point, is to get you to feel like that by the end, like maybe none of this really does matter. But I would have preferred to continue to care about the characters through the end of the book, because when I lost that, I did become bored, which is weird to say, just knowing how the ending went. So yeah, I didn't love it, I didn't hate it. I am glad that I read it. I think if nothing else, it really re-sparked my interest in philosophy, in thought experiments, and I feel like I'd lost that for quite a while. Not purposely, just it kind of becomes less and less a part of your daily routine. When you're in school, you get presented with new ideas all the time, but once you're out of school, you kind of have to seek it out. And while I read lots of books and I get to learn quite a bit that way, it's very rarely in the terms of philosophy. And I very rarely get to read, like, for example, a ton of thought experiments in one book. And so I was grateful that I read it, just to have those moments where I was just thinking about the thought experiment itself. In fact, I got into a groove where I would read the chapter, and then I would read the next thought experiment, but I wouldn't start the chapter that corresponded to it. I would just sit with that thought experiment for a while, just because I wanted to sit there thinking about it. And then I would read the chapter later on, pick it back up, and then read the next thought experiment to think about that for a little bit. But because of that, I think I tended to enjoy the thought experiments more than the book itself. It was really nice how it was laid out, because it explains the thought experiments in a really concise way. So there is that added value. Like, for example, we have a quote here from this thought experiment, but this huge chunk of text is an explanation of the thought experiment. So it's really approachable as a reader to be reading thought experiments just like in your regular day-to-day life without, feeling like you're at school or something. And in watching an interview done with Sophie Ward, as well as reading an interview with her, it does seem like that was a part of the attraction of writing a book like this. And in talking about that interview, you've probably already heard of him, but it was Eric Carl Anderson that did that interview. I will link his channel and that interview specifically in the description, just in case you haven't heard about him, or if you have but you hadn't seen that interview. He did a great job with it, and his videos in general are amazing. He talks a ton about Booker, not just this year, but years previously. So if you're looking for more Booker content, his channel is definitely the place to go. But Sophie Ward talks about making these thought experiments, about making philosophy in general more approachable. And as a concept, I really like that, and it made me want to like this book more, although I still had already read it at that point and had my feelings about it. But what this book is doing, I can really appreciate. I think that this book does do that. Does it do it in the best way possible? Probably not, but it does open that door of having books that are easier to digest, that don't feel like these mammoth texts that are super dense. And still you get 10 thought experiments throughout this book that are explained in a very simple way, and then you still get the story going on behind it. So as a concept, I really do love that. And then also the interview that I ended up reading with Sophie Ward touched on the imposter syndrome, because of course Sophie Ward is venturing into the world of writing books, and not only that, she's writing about philosophy, which I think can sometimes be a very intimidating thing. While it's becoming more and more common for just like regular people, not like these scholars, to talk about and learn philosophy, I think that it still has this stigma that like you need to be in a sports coat with like the patches on the elbows in order to be really talking about philosophy. But philosophy is a fascinating thing, and it's fun to challenge your brain, and it should be more accessible. And in order for it to get to that place where it is more accessible, more authors should be writing about it in accessible ways. So even though Sophie Ward isn't like a philosophy professor, it's really awesome that she wrote a book that highlights thought experiments that she likes as just a regular, well, she's not a regular, like she's an actress and everything, and she's done amazing things, but you know what I mean, like not writing these things like a scholar. It's kind of like with The Good Place, if you've seen that, and the character of Chidi studied philosophy his whole life, but these ideas are still in the show, and just the normal person that is watching The Good Place, an NBC sitcom, can be learning about thought experiments, can be learning about philosophers, and it does make that more accessible. So I love that that exists in that show, and in the same way, I love that it exists in this book. And then of course, that it went on to be on the Booker Longlist. I mean, how cool is that? But let's go ahead and get to my rankings, because as much praise as I did just give the concept of this book, in execution, I still wasn't the biggest fan. Didn't hate it, but definitely didn't love it. Okay, so the rankings that I have right now are Burnt Sugar, Real Life, This Mournable Body, The New Wilderness, Shuggie, Bain, The Shadow King, Such a Fun Age. I think that this book, I struggle whether or not to put it above or below Shuggie, Bain, but I think that Love and Other Thought Experiments is going to stick with me more than Shuggie, Bain will, just because it does have those thought experiments in there. I don't know if it's for the book itself, but I do think that I will continue to think it's thought experiments that were brought about in this book, and in conjunction with that, for some of them, also think about the parts of the story itself that related to those thought experiments. So yeah, that's 5th down on the list. So currently it is still in my top 5, but I do still have quite a few Booker books left to read. So yeah, there's the new rankings. With all that being said, I hope that you did enjoy this video. If you are looking for more Booker content from me, I have done videos on quite a few of the other books on the list. So I will link my playlist below, and then also in the info card. And if you're looking for more content from me in general, then please do consider subscribing, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.